The relationship between South Korea and Japan is plunging to a new low every day since Tokyo placed export restrictions against Seoul on July 4th. In Japan, Foreign Minister Taro Kono's confrontational manner has sparked controversy during a meeting with South Korean Ambassador to Japan, Gwan-pyo. Speculation is mounting that Japan might scratch South Korea from its trade whitelist and impose additional trade curbs. To counter Tokyo's potential moves, some are saying that Seoul should consider terminating the jisomya. The international community is also paying attention to the development of the ongoing rift between South Korea and Japan. The two nations have recently crossed swords at the WTO's General Council meeting in Geneva. The chairman of the General Council hoped the two sides find a friendly solution to resolve the matter diplomatically. Meanwhile, although US President Donald Trump previously has spoken about the issue for the first time, the US delegation that took part in the WTO meeting did not share its view regarding the dispute. It remains to be seen whether South Korea and Japan can find ways to resolve the heightened conflict through diplomacy.
Hello, welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm your host, Daniel Che. The trade dispute between South Korea and Japan, it has been a topic of discussion at the WTO, and also global media outlets have been paying attention and sharing their thoughts on the matter. It is a discussion topic for today's episode as well. Do join me in the studio for more. Let's get to the point. And to help us delve deeper into today's topic, we're joined by Lee Hyun, Professor of Law from Handong University. Thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a topic that we've been discussing for weeks now, and we're seeing not much progress made, positive developments at least. The diplomatic tension is reaching new highs, especially with Tokyo taking such actions like on July 20th, when Foreign Minister Taro Kono summoned South Korea's ambassador, and the atmosphere and the gesture, it seemed rather intentional to try and, I suppose, belittle Korea.
It's not uncommon for an ambassador to be called into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, especially when there's tensions between two countries. And in some cases, these meetings are televised. But I think in this instance, it's clear that the foreign minister intentionally interrupted Ambassador Nam in this case because it was a made-for-TV moment. It was for primarily the Japanese audience to show that the Japanese were taking a hard line against the South Koreans, and also for the South Korean audience to demonstrate that the Japanese were taking this issue very seriously.
Clearly, it's all about the optics for sure. And during the meeting, Kono kept his narratives in such a confrontational manner that even Japanese staff were surprised to see him go overboard. Here's a short clip of what happened that day.
측이 함께 지혜를 모아 나가기를 기대하고 있습니다.
ちょっと待ってください。韓国側の提案は全く受け入れられるものでない。以前に韓国側にお伝えをしております。それを知らないふりをして改めて提案するのは極めて無礼でございます。
There are many instances in South Korea where the Japanese ambassador is summoned, but I don't think we were that hostile towards the Japanese representative.
Again, I think this is an issue where the Japanese really want to convey the message that they take this issue very, very seriously. And this is, I think, a theme from the Japanese side consistently over the number of years that the Abe administration has been in power, that it is going to take a hardline stance against the South Korean government with respect to these historical matters.
And the FM claims that we violated international law going back to the 1965 treaty. That seems to be Tokyo's go-to argument. What is their intention in terms of sticking with this particular notion, the 1965 treaty?
Well, from the Japanese perspective, the 1965 agreement essentially eliminated all claims that South Koreans could make against Japanese companies as well as the Japanese government. So from their perspective, they think that this has extinguished all individual claims arising out of the colonial period as well as World War II. And this includes comfort women issues as well as forced labor questions. And so the Japanese side really believes that by sticking to this particular agreement, that they have the strongest legal argument with respect to these kinds of claims. And then, therefore, if there's been any problems between the two sides, that this should go to arbitration.
Right. Now, after the Kono statement, some sides indicate Seoul is looking into countermeasures like reviewing the military intel pact with Japan, the GSOMIA. An extension decision must be made by August 23rd. So how much leverage does this card offer?
Well, I'm not sure how much leverage the Korean side has with respect to eliminating this agreement or not renewing the intelligence pact. But if Korea does do so, it will certainly be a significant sign of the deepening rift between the two countries, but also show that Korea is willing to go beyond trade and the economy to include these kinds of measures with respect to this kind of matter. So it would be a real big, significant issue if this is done.
Well, what about the U.S.? They must be taken a little bit off guard because it involves their alliance with the two countries as well.
I think the United States certainly takes this very seriously, and that's why I think you saw John Bolton come recently to both countries to talk to both sides about maybe lessening the tensions between the two sides. But it's unclear how much the United States really will get involved in this kind of matter because of the significant issues that the United States faces in the world around today.
And on July 23rd, Japan's trade restrictions was discussed as one of the formal agenda items at the WTO General Council. They're saying, first of all, South Korea is saying that Japan has violated the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT. That Article 11 of GATT states that you are not supposed to put export restrictions on WTO members.
Right, and that's why I think the Korean side really wants to take this matter potentially to the WTO to involve itself in maybe formal dispute settlement processes. But before that, I think the Korean side and the Japanese side are, I think, working to maybe resolve this issue diplomatically, but it's unclear how successful this will be given the public tension that exists between the two sides.
Right, and Japan, of course, has the rights to remove South Korea from its whitelist, as something that South Korea is strongly against. And of course, the international community will decide if this is something that should not be taken by Japan.
Right. There are certain preferential measures which countries can take for each other. So as long as they don't obviate GATT agreement, there's no reason for Japan to necessarily put measures that would make it harder for the Koreans to get these products. But if the Japanese do, in fact, put some specific restrictions that limits the flow of trade between the two nations, that's where we're going to see problems.
Well, it looks like in Japan, it's more or less they got the green light to try and remove South Korea from the whitelist. And South Korea sent our side, our take on the issue as well regarding the whitelist issue.
Right. Korea obviously wants to make sure that its companies are protected, and certainly with respect to these kinds of issues of these kinds of industrial products entering Korea, obviously the Korean companies are very dependent on these sourcing from the Japanese side. And so this kind of action by the Japanese is certainly going to make it harder for the Koreans to get access to these materials on a timely basis. But I think you'll see that now the Korean companies will now try to be less dependent on the Japanese side and try to find alternative suppliers for these kinds of goods.
That's probably not good news for the Japanese economy, especially the sectors that has been exporting a lot of their materials to South Korea. And these are some of the remarks made during the WTO General Council. Let's have a look.
Japanese ambassador evade to give us concrete answer. So I ask again to respond my proposed offer, but he flatly turned down without giving me any plausible reasons. This Japanese attitude is consistent with what Japanese has shown us for 20 days.
But I just emphasized that the measure taken by Japan is not a trade embargo. It's not a countermeasure against any trade-related issue. It is about the measure taken on the basis of export control. And that is why we believe that it is not an appropriate to be discussed in the WTO.
To no one's surprise, contrasting claims are made by South Korea and Japan. Which side would likely gain support from the global community after this session, in your opinion?
I think it depends on the narrative and the supporting facts that you believe on either side. On the Japanese side, the claim is going to be that Korea is not abiding by its agreements, from the 1965 agreement to the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement. So from the Japanese side, the portrayal of Korea is that it can't be trusted with international agreements, and that essentially Japan is fed up with the Korean side in terms of seeking to go back to the past and not looking to the future. So that's the Japanese narrative. On the South Korean side, however, the South Korean narrative is going to be that it is unfair, Japan is unfairly linking trade with a decision by the judicial branch, which is an independent branch of the government, which the executive branch has no power over. And so taking such a provocative measure by linking trade and this trade issue is really unfair. And so moreover, after being committed to talking about free trade and publicly declaring that free trade is important at the G20 meetings in Osaka, the Korean side is going to portray the Japanese potentially as being hypocritical in saying that we're for free trade, but not when it comes to our own national interests.
Right, and as for the WTO taking a look and trying to play their part to help settle this case, it's going to be like taking off, flying and then landing a plane. It will take a long time. So the trade dispute would not only hurt two sides, South Korea and Japan, but also other nations. Who do you think the ruling would favor in the end?
If this ever goes to the WTO dispute settlement process, as you said, it's going to take a while. But I think ultimately in the end, if Korea can demonstrate that it is abiding by its own commitments and that Japan has failed to meet its GATT obligations to Korea, and that Japan has failed to meet its burden to say that it is acting within Article 21, then Korea likely is going to win the case. But that's a long time from now, and so we'll see whether or not the two sides can resolve this issue in a diplomatic fashion.
Well, the fact that the dispute between the two Asian superpowers affect the global economy as a whole encourage WTO to expedite the process of reviewing this issue?
It's unlikely that this will happen. There's usually a set process with respect to WTO dispute settlement procedures. There are procedures potentially to speed up the rulings. However, because the process is a laborious process involving international transactions and international litigation, the procedure is very exacting. And so therefore, it's going to take a while for this decision to ultimately come out, if it does come out in Korea's favor.
Right, we'll have to wait and see. Now, while the global community stayed busy discussing the bilateral spat, a crucial upper house election took place over in Japan. Here's a short clip of how the poll turned out.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's ruling coalition won a majority of contested seats in Japan's upper house election that took place on July 21st, making it difficult for South Korea-Japan relations to see resolution anytime soon. Having garnered 71 of 124 seats up for grabs in the latest election, the ruling bloc, which initially had 70 seats secured, gets to retain its majority in the upper house with a total of 141 seats. Asked if he has any intention to hold a summit with South Korea while appearing on a television network conducting live election coverage, Prime Minister Abe said there would be no constructive discussions unless Seoul brings a proper response regarding the court rulings.
安定した政治基盤の上にしっかりと政策を進めていけ、そして国益を守るための外交を進めていけというご判断をいただいたと思っておりますので、期待に応えていきたいと思います。
The Abe cabinet is expected to see more people from within the nation to oppose its trade curbs on South Korea, as 5 opposition parties have succeeded in putting a brake to the ruling bloc from winning the 2/3 super majority, which is required to revise the nation's pacifist constitution.
Even public opinion polls show that not the entirety of Japan is exactly warming up to the idea of amending the pacifist constitution. Do you think Abe will continue to stick with this goal without turning to a possible plan B or perhaps putting this in the back burner?
Well, if the political winds in Japan change, he can certainly call a snap election and to see whether or not he can get the 2/3 majority that he desires. But for the time being, as you said, the populace in Japan is, I think, split on the question of whether or not they want to change the constitution. So I think that he's going to be in a holding pattern, and by his public statements after the election, I think there's no rush for him at this moment to seek to amend the constitution, but to maintain what he said, a stable government.
Right, a goal that he will stick towards until the day he steps down from office. Now, let's find out how locals are feeling about the election results. We have Jonathan Berkshire Miller, Senior Fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs, connected to us live via Skype to share with us his insights. Hello there.
Well, thanks again for having me on.
Thank you so much for making time for us. How is the public reacting to the outcome of the upper house election?
Well, thanks for the question. With regard to the upper house election that just happened, I think generally the mood in Japan is one of not very much surprise, really. This was kind of expected that the ruling party, the Liberal Democrats, in coalition with the Komeito, would maintain some sort of majority. So I think that was not a surprise to most of the media here or some of the intellectuals. I think the one thing that was kind of a setback for Abe was not maintaining the 2/3 supermajority that he had with the Komeito party. That was a difficult bar to achieve this time in many senses because of the success of the last upper house election and the amount of seats that the LDP and Komeito won at that point. So that would have been a difficult bar to achieve. But why that matters is because when it comes to the Constitution amendment, which is something that the Abe administration has put forward as a serious, ambitious goal, in its remaining third term, which is supposed to end in 2021, requires 2/3 of both houses. So that essentially has effectively kind of taken that off the table for the Abe administration. His only option, he did mention after the election, Prime Minister Abe, that he wants to work with opposition parties on this constitutional amendment, but the reality is that this becomes very, very difficult. So I think generally the mood was relatively upbeat, and on the election, it wasn't something that was seen as a very surprising result. But it does underscore the stability, I think, for Abe going into his third and potentially final term.
We're curious to know how this election has affected South Korea and Japan relations. Do you think that now that the elections are over, will Tokyo maintain its hardline stance against Seoul?
Well, thanks very much for that question. With regard to the potential impact on Japan-South Korea relations due to the election, unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be a appreciable change due to the upper house results. We've been seeing this a little bit with some reports on the South Korean side that the GSOMIA, or the General Security of Military Information Agreement, which kind of shares military information and intelligence on North Korea's WMD and ballistic missile programs, that this may be something that is up for renegotiation, or something that may not continue in the coming months. I think that would be a big concern, not only to Japan, but also to the U.S. So this is something where we see U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton in the region now talking to both sides. And that will probably be an area to look at going forward. On the positive side, what could be a potential, and I'm not sure that the Prime Minister's office has made a determination on this yet, but there is a trilateral summit that is supposed to be planned this year in China. So this would be a Japan, China, South Korea trilateral summit. This process has been challenged several times. Sometimes it's on the opposite side, where Japan and China have had their issues. Other times, China and South Korea have had their issues, especially with regard to the deployment of the THAAD missile defense battery. But now it is back to Japan and Korea having their issues. Why this is an important mechanism is that I think it provides that kind of diplomatic camouflage, or that sort of opening for the two sides that are in the most contentious state to essentially force them into a state where they can have bilateral meetings. Whether that meeting will actually take place this year, as scheduled, I think is in question. But that is a potential opportunity on the high-level diplomatic side. But I don't see any noticeable change due to the election result.
All right, thank you so much, Jonathan, for your time and your expertise. Coming back to you, Professor, Bloomberg took a big jab at Japan, especially with the decisions they've made in terms of the export curbs against Seoul, saying they must lift it and that Japan is to end the, quote, foolish trade spat. Is this proof that the global media is siding with South Korea and are more critical of Japan's latest moves?
I think the global media is generally not favorable towards trade wars, particularly those trade wars which impact free trade, and it's bad for business and bad for basically everyone in the global economy. And so I think what you're seeing is a reaction from the global media saying that Japan needs to do more with respect to this question in terms of promoting the things that it is announced that it's favored for, free trade and prosperity for mutual prosperity for all nations.
Right, and for the U.S., it's a tricky situation, a rather difficult situation, because both South Korea and Japan are very important allies and partners economically and otherwise. But recently, President Trump stepped up and made some comments about the matter. Does this mean Washington might be more involved with this trade dispute?
I think the United States takes it very seriously. Again, with the recent visit of John Bolton, and you may see others coming through the region to talk to both sides to ensure that cooperation on a strategic level is not compromised. But whether or not President Trump himself will be involved is another question. As you know, he's going through lots of difficulties domestically. He's potentially facing impeachment from the House. He's got an election coming up next year. So how much he's going to be personally involved is going to be a question that's left up in the air. But I think if this ratchets it up, and you'll see that if this doesn't get resolved anytime soon, you may see the Secretary of State visiting, you may even see the Vice President visiting at some point, but that remains to be seen.
Of course, Trump is no stranger to trade wars, two words that are, of course, in his quick-release holster of vocabulary, possibly. Now, we do have a clip of what President Donald Trump said about the bilateral rift in a recent interview. Let's roll it.
There is ongoing tension between Japan and Korea. In fact, the president of Korea asked me if I could get involved. And Japan has some things that South Korea wants, and he asked me to get involved. So maybe if they would both want me to, I'll be. It's like a full-time job, getting involved between Japan and South Korea. But I like both leaders. I like President Moon, and you know how I feel about Prime Minister Abe. He's a very special guy also. So if they need me, I'm there.
Well, I think the biggest fear or concern right now is both sides, South Korea and Japan, taking bigger and bolder actions to try and deal a counter blow to each other. What do you anticipate happening from here on? We are, of course, keeping our fingers crossed that they might calm down and talk things over and solve things diplomatically, of course.
Well, I don't think it's going to ratchet down anytime soon. I think it'll get worse before it gets better. There's no political incentive for either side to back down at this point. The Moon administration has clearly made its point clear that this is an unfair move by the Japanese and it's going to hurt the Korean economy, and the Korean economy is going to suffer as a result. And the Japanese side, from the Abe administration, there's no incentive for them to change course either, because they just won an election. And for the Abe administration to back off at this point would be, I think, losing face to some degree. So there has to be some movement on either side, and I think each side is waiting for the other to make a move in the right direction.
Well, let's hope with the international community and the world taking notice of this escalating tension, the two sides will be able to perhaps take some note from third parties' perspectives and talk it over soon, and we'll have some positive news to offer the next time we sit down for talks. Professor Lee Hyun, thank you so much for coming. We appreciate you coming in and making our program complete today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
The trade spat between South Korea and Japan continues to escalate. We have the latest developments on this story. Let's roll the clip.
Japan will make its decision on whether or not to remove South Korea from its whitelist of countries that enjoy preferential trade conditions on August 2nd, according to the Japanese news agency Kyodo News. Japanese daily Yomiuri Shimbun also reported that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's cabinet will review the new trade rules approval on the same day. If Tokyo's expanded export control measures are given the green light, it will go into effect 21 days after being approved. If South Korea is removed from the whitelist, Japanese exporters will have to apply case by case in order to ship restricted items to South Korea.
U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross says the U.S. is willing to play a mediating role in South Korea's trade dispute with Japan. This is according to Seoul's Trade Minister Yoo Myung-hee. This came after Yoo met with her U.S. counterpart for an hour at the U.S. Department of Commerce on Thursday.
U.S. Commerce Secretary recognized the negative effects of the unfair export control measures on U.S. industry as well as the global economy and mentioned it would do its necessary role.
Speaking to reporters in Washington, D.C., she also emphasized that the U.S. representative seemed well aware of how Japan's export restrictions could harm American industries, including the smartphone and semiconductor sectors. As to what kind of the role the U.S. will play, Yoo only noted that the U.S. is well aware of its role in the Seoul-Tokyo trade dispute.
That's all we have for you today. Do join us again same time next week for a brand new episode of The Point, World Affairs. Thank you so much for watching.